The sound of Tasha Williams being dragged across the wooden stage echoed through the stunned silence of 3,000 graduation attendees, like a thunderclap in a cloudless sky. Her cap tumbled to the ground, the gold tassel catching the afternoon sunlight as Officer Patricia McKenzie's meaty hands gripped the young woman's arm with enough force to leave bruises that would last for weeks. "No displays of emotion allowed," Mackenzie's voice boomed through the microphone system, drowning out the gasps and murmurs rippling through the crowd like wildfire. Just moments before, Tasha had been standing at the podium, her voice clear and strong as she delivered the valedictorian speech she had crafted with painstaking care over the past 3 months. The words had flowed from her lips like honey, each syllable carefully chosen to inspire her fellow graduates while honoring the struggles they had all endured to reach this pinnacle moment. She had spoken of resilience, of dreams deferred but never abandoned, of the power of education to transform lives and communities. The audience had been captivated, hanging on every word as she painted a vision of hope and possibility for the class of 2023. Tasha Williams had always been exceptional, from the moment she first walked through the doors of Roosevelt Elementary School. Teachers recognized something special in the quiet girl with the bright eyes and quick smile. She absorbed knowledge like a sponge, asking questions that revealed a mind constantly working, constantly growing, constantly reaching for something beyond her immediate circumstances. By middle school, she was already taking high school-level courses. By her sophomore year, she was enrolled in every advanced placement class the school offered, maintaining a perfect 4.0 GPA while simultaneously working part-time at the local library to help support her family. Her father had always been her greatest supporter, though his identity remained carefully guarded within their household. Dr. Marcus Williams had built his career in higher education administration through decades of tireless work. Beginning as a teaching assistant fresh out of graduate school and slowly climbing the academic ladder through sheer determination and an unwavering commitment to educational excellence. When the Board of Trustees at Riverside University offered him the presidency 3 years ago, he accepted with the understanding that his daughter would soon be graduating from the very institution he now led. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest professional achievement coincided with his greatest personal pride, watching Tasha grow into the remarkable young woman she had become. The morning of graduation had dawned bright and clear, with not a single cloud marring the perfect blue canvas of the May sky. Tasha had awakened before her alarm, too excited to sleep, and spent the early hours reviewing her speech one final time. She had practiced it dozens of times in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her inflection, perfecting her timing, ensuring that every gesture and pause would have maximum impact. This was her moment, the culmination of 12 years of academic excellence, and she was determined to make it count. Her mother, Dr. Angela Williams, had helped her get ready, carefully arranging the graduation cap on her daughter's perfectly styled hair and smoothing invisible wrinkles from the pristine black gown. "Remember, baby," Angela had whispered as she straightened Tasha's honor cords. "You've earned every bit of this. Walk proud, speak from your heart, and let the world see the amazing woman you've become." The mother and daughter had embraced tightly, both fighting back tears that threatened to smudge carefully applied makeup. The gymnasium had filled early, with families claiming prime seating positions and setting up elaborate photography equipment to capture every precious moment. The class of 2023 was the largest in the school's history, with 847 graduates representing a diversity of backgrounds, ambitions, and dreams. For many of these students, they were the first in their families to graduate from high school, let alone receive acceptance letters to prestigious universities. The air buzzed with anticipation, nervous energy, and the kind of joy that comes from achieving something that once seemed impossible. Tasha had taken her place among the other honor students in the front row, her valedictorian medal catching the gymnasium lights as she settled into her seat. She had looked out into the sea of faces, searching for her parents in the crowd, finding comfort in their beaming smiles and encouraging nods. Her father sat in the administrative section, maintaining the professional composure required of his position, while his heart swelled with paternal pride. Few people in the audience knew that the distinguished university president was watching his own daughter prepare to deliver the keynote address. Principal Davidson had introduced her with glowing praise, rattling off her impressive list of academic achievements, scholarship awards, and extracurricular activities. Tasha Williams represents the very best of what our school system can produce, he had declared, his voice carrying across the hushed auditorium. She is proof that with dedication, hard work, and unwavering determination, any dream is within reach. Ladies and gentlemen, your valedictorian, Tasha Williams. The applause had been thunderous as Tasha approached the podium, her steps measured and confident despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. She had begun her speech with a story about her grandmother, a woman who had been denied an education because of the color of her skin, but who had instilled in her granddaughter an unshakable belief in the transformative power of learning. My grandmother used to tell me that education is the one thing no one can ever take away from you, Tasha had said, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium sound system. She said that knowledge is like a light that grows brighter with every book you read, every question you ask, every challenge you overcome. The audience had been completely engaged, nodding along as Tasha wove together themes of perseverance, community, and hope. She spoke about classmates who had overcome poverty, family tragedy, and systemic obstacles to reach this moment. She honored the teachers who had believed in them when they struggled to believe in themselves, the parents who had worked multiple jobs to provide opportunities their children might not have otherwise had, and the community leaders who had opened doors and created pathways where none had existed before. We are not just graduating today, Tasha had continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. We are declaring to the world that we refuse to be limited by circumstances beyond our control. We are announcing that our dreams are not negotiable. Our potential is not up for debate, and our future is not dependent on anyone's permission, but our own. The crowd had erupted in enthusiastic applause at several points during her speech, parents and faculty members visibly moved by her eloquence and passion. Even the usually stoic school board members had been seen wiping away tears as Tasha painted a picture of a future where her generation would break down barriers and build bridges across the divides that had separated communities for too long. But as Tasha had neared the conclusion of her speech, something had begun to shift in the atmosphere of the gymnasium. Officer Patricia McKenzie, hired as additional security for the large graduation ceremony, had been growing increasingly agitated as she watched the emotional responses of the audience. McKenzie was a 20-year veteran of the local police force, a woman whose rigid adherence to rules and regulations had earned her both respect and criticism throughout her career. She had volunteered for graduation duty, expecting a routine assignment, not the passionate oratory that was currently unfolding on the stage. McKenzie had built her reputation on maintaining order and discipline, viewing any display of emotion as a potential threat to the controlled environment she believed necessary for public safety. She had watched with growing disapproval as audience members stood to applaud, as some wiped away tears, as others called out words of encouragement to the young speaker. In Mackenzie's worldview, such displays were inappropriate for a formal ceremony, regardless of their positive nature or the skill of the speaker who had inspired them. As Tasha had reached her closing remarks, her voice rising with conviction as she challenged her classmates to go forth and change the world, not because it will be easy, but because it is necessary. The audience had responded with a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Students had cheered, parents had whistled, and faculty members had applauded with genuine enthusiasm for a speech that would be remembered as one of the finest in the school's history. It was at this moment, as Tasha had stepped back from the podium with tears of joy glistening in her eyes, that several of her closest friends had approached the stage. Marcus Johnson, her study partner since sophomore year, had been the first to reach her, wrapping her in a congratulatory hug as flashbulbs popped throughout the gymnasium. Sarah Chen, her debate team co-captain, had joined them, followed by David Rodriguez, her lab partner in advanced chemistry. For 30 seconds, maybe less, the four friends had embraced on the stage, overwhelmed by the moment and the realization that they had actually made it to graduation, despite all the obstacles they had faced along the way. To anyone watching with empathy and understanding, the scene was beautiful. Four young people who had supported each other through years of academic pressure, family challenges, and teenage struggles, finally celebrating their shared achievement in a moment of pure, unguarded joy. They were not causing a disturbance, not disrupting the ceremony, not behaving inappropriately in any objective sense. They were simply being human, allowing themselves to feel the full weight of their accomplishment without the emotional barriers that adults so often construct around such moments. But Officer McKenzie saw something entirely different. She saw a breach of protocol, a violation of the formal atmosphere she had been hired to maintain, a display of emotion that needed to be controlled and contained before it spread to other graduates or audience members. Her training had taught her to identify potential problems before they escalated, and, in her judgment, this spontaneous celebration represented exactly the kind of disruption that could spiral out of control if not addressed immediately and decisively. McKenzie had pushed through the line of faculty members seated behind the podium, her heavy footsteps echoing ominously across the wooden stage as she approached the group of friends. "Break it up," she had commanded, her voice harsh and authoritative in the way that only comes from years of expecting immediate compliance. No displays of emotion allowed during the ceremony. The friends had looked up in confusion, their faces still glowing with the aftermath of Tasha's triumphant speech. They had stepped apart willingly, not understanding why their brief celebration was being treated as a violation, but willing to comply with official instructions. Tasha had reached for the microphone, intending to transition smoothly into the next portion of the ceremony. But McKenzie had moved faster. "I said no displays of emotion," McKenzie had repeated, her voice now amplified through the sound system as she yanked the microphone from Tasha's grasp with enough force to send feedback squealing through the gymnasium speakers. The harsh electronic screech had caused audience members to wince and cover their ears, creating the first moment of genuine disruption in what had otherwise been a perfectly executed ceremony. Before anyone could react, before Tasha could explain or apologize or even process what was happening, McKenzie had grabbed her arm and begun pulling her away from the podium. The officer's grip was professional but painful, designed to ensure compliance rather than comfort. And Tasha had stumbled slightly as she was forced to move faster than her graduation gown would comfortably allow. "Wait, I don't understand," Tasha had managed to say, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the nearby microphones. "What did I do wrong?" But McKenzie had not been interested in explanations or dialogue. In her mind, the situation was clear. A student had violated protocol, disrupted the ceremony, and needed to be removed from the stage to prevent further problems. The audience had watched in growing shock and disbelief as their valedictorian, the young woman who had just delivered a speech that had moved many of them to tears, was being physically dragged across the stage like a common criminal. Parents had begun to stand, their voices rising in confusion and protest. "What's going on?" someone had called out. "Why are they doing that to her?" Another voice had demanded. Students in the graduating class had turned in their seats, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion, anger, and fear as they watched their classmate being manhandled by law enforcement. Many of them pulled out their phones, instinctively beginning to record what was unfolding before their eyes. The graduation ceremony that was supposed to be the proudest moment of their lives was transforming into something darker, something that would be analyzed and debated for years to come. Tasha's parents had been frozen in their seats. Dr. Williams gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white as he fought every instinct that screamed at him to intervene. His wife had placed a restraining hand on his arm, knowing that any action he took in that moment could make the situation worse for their daughter. They had watched helplessly as the child they had raised to believe in justice and fairness was being treated with a level of disrespect that defied comprehension. McKenzie had dragged Tasha to the side of the stage, away from the podium and the main ceremony area, but still visible to much of the audience. The officer's face had been set in grim determination, convinced that she was doing her job properly, despite the growing chorus of voices questioning her actions. She had positioned herself between Tasha and the crowd, using her body as a barrier while she radioed for backup. "Control. This is McKenzie at the high school graduation." She had spoken into her radio, the device crackling with static that was audible to nearby audience members. "I have a student in custody for disrupting the ceremony, requesting additional units to assist with crowd control." The word custody had sent a ripple of alarm through the gymnasium, as parents and students began to realize that this was not simply a misunderstanding that would be quickly resolved. Principal Davidson had rushed to the microphone, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion, as he tried to restore order to a ceremony that had suddenly spiraled out of his control. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," he had announced, his voice shaky with uncertainty. "We're going to take a brief intermission to resolve this situation. Please stay in your seats." But his words had done little to calm the growing agitation in the audience, particularly among the parents and students who could see that something was terribly wrong. Marcus Johnson, still standing on the stage where the group hug had taken place, had found his voice despite his shock. "This is insane," he had called out, loud enough to be heard throughout the gymnasium. "She didn't do anything wrong. She just gave the best speech any of us has ever heard." Other students had begun to voice their agreement, their protests growing louder as they overcame their initial paralysis. Sarah Chen had pulled out her phone and was already broadcasting live on social media, her voice urgent as she narrated what was happening. "This is Sarah Chen at Roosevelt High School graduation, and you guys are not going to believe what's happening right now. Our valedictorian just gave an amazing speech, and now a cop is literally dragging her off the stage for hugging her friends. This is completely insane." The live stream had already attracted dozens of viewers, and the number was climbing rapidly as Sarah's followers began sharing the broadcast with their own networks. Comments were flooding in, expressing outrage and disbelief at what they were witnessing. Within minutes, the incident was spreading across multiple social media platforms, with hashtags like "Justice for Tasha" and "Graduation Injustice" beginning to trend. Back on the stage, McKenzie had been growing increasingly frustrated with what she perceived as a lack of cooperation from both Tasha and the crowd. The young woman had not resisted physically, but she had continued to ask questions, to seek explanations for why she was being treated this way. "Officer, please, can you just tell me what I did wrong?" Tasha had pleaded, her voice carrying a note of desperation that cut through the chaos around them. "You disrupted the ceremony with an inappropriate display of emotion," McKenzie had replied curtly, her training taking over as she recited the justification she had constructed for her actions. "You allowed unauthorized individuals onto the stage area, and you failed to maintain proper decorum during a formal event." The words had sounded hollow, even to her own ears. But McKenzie had committed to her course of action and saw no way to back down without losing face. Dr. Angela Williams had finally reached her breaking point. Standing in the administrative section, she had called out in a voice that carried across the gymnasium with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "That is my daughter, and she has done nothing wrong." The words had hit the audience like a physical force, and suddenly, everyone was looking at the elegant woman who had spoken with such conviction. McKenzie had heard the shout, but had not immediately understood its significance. She had glanced toward the administrative section, noting the well-dressed African-American woman who was now standing with her hands clenched at her sides. But the officer's focus had remained on what she perceived as her primary duty, maintaining control of the situation she had created. It was at this moment that backup officers had arrived, responding to McKenzie's earlier radio call. 2 additional uniformed personnel had entered the gymnasium, their presence creating an even greater sense of urgency and alarm among the audience. The sight of multiple law enforcement officers at what was supposed to be a celebration had pushed the crowd's emotions from confusion to genuine anger. "This is ridiculous," a parent had shouted from the stands. "She's the valedictorian. She just gave a beautiful speech." Other voices had joined in, creating a chorus of protest that was growing louder and more organized by the minute. The graduating students had begun to stand in their seats, some linking arms in a show of solidarity with their classmate who was being treated so unjustly. McKenzie had made the decision to remove Tasha from the main gymnasium entirely, believing that relocating the situation would help calm the crowd and allow her to better control the circumstances. She had begun to escort Tasha toward a side exit, the young woman's graduation gown trailing behind her as she was forced to walk faster than was comfortable in her dress shoes. "Where are you taking me?" Tasha had asked, her voice now carrying the first notes of real fear. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was being arrested at her own graduation, in front of her family and friends, for reasons that made no sense to her or to anyone else who had witnessed the events leading up to this moment. "To a secure location, where we can discuss your behavior without further disrupting the ceremony," McKenzie had replied, using the kind of official language that was designed to make her actions sound reasonable and necessary. But to everyone watching, it was clear that a gross injustice was unfolding, that a young woman who had done nothing more than excel academically and celebrate appropriately was being criminalized for reasons that seemed to have more to do with prejudice than protocol. The side room that McKenzie had chosen was a small conference area adjacent to the main gymnasium, typically used for parent-teacher meetings and administrative discussions. It was windowless and cramped, with a single table surrounded by uncomfortable plastic chairs and fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows on everything it touched. The stark environment felt like a punishment cell, a place where problems were contained rather than solved. Tasha had been placed in one of the chairs, her graduation cap long since lost in the chaos of being dragged across the stage. Her carefully styled hair was now disheveled, and her honor cords were tangled and askew. But despite her physical disarray, her spirit remained unbroken. She sat with her back straight and her chin raised, maintaining the dignity that no amount of mistreatment could take away from her. "I want to know what law I've broken," Tasha had said clearly, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I want to know what gives you the right to treat me this way, and I want to call my parents." Her words had carried the confidence of someone who had been raised to understand her rights and to advocate for herself when those rights were being violated. McKenzie had positioned herself near the door, effectively blocking Tasha's exit while maintaining the pretense that this was a voluntary discussion rather than a detention. The officer had pulled out a small notebook and pen, preparing to document the incident in a way that would justify her actions and protect her from potential criticism or disciplinary action. Let's start with your name and student identification number. McKenzie had begun, her tone suggesting that this was a routine procedure rather than an unprecedented overreach of authority. But before Tasha could respond, before the interrogation could continue, the door to the conference room had burst open with enough force to rattle the cheap walls. Dr. Marcus Williams had finally reached his limit. For 20 minutes, he had watched from the administrative section as his daughter was subjected to treatment that was not only unjust, but completely unprecedented in his decades of experience in educational settings. He had witnessed McKenzie's escalating aggression, heard the officer's radio calls requesting backup, and seen his child disappear into a side room like a criminal being processed for booking. The university president had excused himself from the administrative section with as much dignity as he could muster, walking calmly through the corridors of the school he had attended as a child, while his heart pounded with a mixture of rage and protective instinct that threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. He had followed the sounds of radio chatter and official conversation until he found the conference room where his daughter was being held. When Dr. Williams had opened that door, the sight that greeted him had been both heartbreaking and infuriating. His daughter, the brilliant young woman who had just delivered one of the finest speeches he had ever heard, was sitting in a plastic chair like a suspect awaiting interrogation. Her graduation regalia was disheveled, her dignity under assault, and her future potentially being damaged by an officer who seemed to have no understanding of the gravity of her actions. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Doctor?" Williams had asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He had not raised his voice, had not made any threatening gestures, but the power in his tone had been unmistakable. This was not a question being asked by a concerned parent. This was a demand being made by someone with the authority to require answers. McKenzie had looked up from her notebook, clearly annoyed by the interruption, but not yet understanding who she was dealing with. "Sir, you need to leave immediately. This is an official police matter, and unauthorized personnel are not permitted in this area." Her response had been automatic, the kind of dismissive brush-off she had used countless times with people she considered irrelevant to her official duties. "Dad," Tasha had exclaimed, relief flooding her voice as she recognized her father's imposing figure in the doorway. For the first time since this ordeal had begun, she had felt a surge of hope that someone with real authority might be able to make sense of this senseless situation and bring it to an end. Dr. Williams had stepped fully into the room, his presence seeming to fill the cramped space as he positioned himself between McKenzie and his daughter, at 6 feet, 2 inches tall, with the confident bearing of someone who had spent years commanding respect in academic and professional settings. He was an imposing figure, even without considering his official position. "Officer," he had said, his voice now carrying an edge that suggested barely controlled anger. "I am Dr. Marcus Williams, president of Riverside University, and this is my daughter. I want to know immediately what justification you believe you have for treating a graduating valedictorian like a criminal suspect." The words had hit McKenzie like a physical blow. In all her calculations about how to handle the situation, in all her assumptions about the people she was dealing with, she had never considered that the young woman she had dragged off the stage might be connected to someone with real power and influence. The realization that she had just publicly humiliated the daughter of a university president, in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless social media cameras, had begun to sink in with horrifying clarity. She was disrupting the ceremony," McKenzie had stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating as she tried to maintain her justification in the face of this unexpected development. There were unauthorized displays of emotion, and protocol required intervention to maintain order. But even as she spoke the words, they sounded increasingly hollow and inadequate. "Dr. Williams had turned to his daughter, his expression softening as he took in her disheveled appearance and the lingering fear in her eyes. "Are you hurt?" he had asked gently, his hand reaching out to straighten her honor cords, with the tender care of a father who would move mountains to protect his child. "No, Dad, I'm not hurt," Tasha had replied, though her voice carried the emotional bruises that would take much longer to heal than any physical injury. "But I don't understand what I did wrong. I gave my speech. My friends came up to congratulate me. And then she started yelling and dragging me away. I don't understand any of this." The university president had turned back to McKenzie. And now, his voice had carried the full weight of his position and his paternal fury. "Officer, I have been involved in educational ceremonies for over 20 years, and I have never witnessed such an egregious abuse of authority. My daughter delivered a speech that moved an entire audience to tears, accepted congratulations from her closest friends in a display of joy that lasted less than 30 seconds. And you responded by physically assaulting her in front of 3,000 witnesses." McKenzie had tried to interrupt, to offer some defense of her actions. But Dr. Williams had continued with the relentless precision of someone presenting an irrefutable case. "Furthermore, you have detained a minor without cause, without reading her any rights, without allowing her to contact her parents or legal representation, and without any legal justification whatsoever. You have turned what should have been the proudest moment of a young woman's life into a public humiliation that will be remembered long after her academic achievements are forgotten." The officer had begun to realize that her situation was far more serious than she had initially understood. Not only had she made a spectacular error in judgment, but she had done so in front of an audience that included some of the most influential people in the community. The social media coverage alone would ensure that her actions would be scrutinized by millions of people, many of whom would have no difficulty seeing the injustice of what had occurred. "Sir, I was following established protocols for maintaining order during public events." McKenzie had tried one more time, but her voice had lacked conviction. Even she was beginning to understand that no reasonable protocol could justify what she had done to an honor student whose only crime had been accepting congratulations from her friends. Dr. Williams had pulled out his phone, and his next words had carried the weight of someone about to use every resource at his disposal to ensure justice was served. "I am going to call the superintendent, the school board president, the mayor, and the chief of police. Then, I am going to return to that gymnasium, take the microphone, and explain to everyone present exactly what has happened here today. And then, Officer McKenzie, you and I are going to have a very public discussion about how law enforcement should properly interact with students in educational settings." The mention of his intention to make this situation public had galvanized McKenzie in a way that previous arguments had not. The prospect of having her actions exposed and critiqued in front of the entire community, of having to defend her behavior to supervisors who would already be under pressure to respond decisively, had finally broken through her stubborn adherence to her initial decision. "Dr. Williams, perhaps we can resolve this matter privately," she had suggested, her tone now conciliatory rather than authoritative. "There may have been some miscommunication about the situation, and I'm sure we can work something out that doesn't require involving additional parties." But her attempt at damage control had come too late, and the university president had already decided that this situation required maximum transparency and accountability. "Officer, the time for private resolution passed the moment you put your hands on my daughter." Dr. Williams had replied, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for negotiation. "What happens next will be very public, because the community needs to understand what occurred here today and why it must never be allowed to happen again." Tasha had watched this exchange with growing amazement and relief. After 30 minutes of being treated like a criminal for no comprehensible reason, She was finally seeing someone with real authority step in to advocate for her and demand accountability from the person who had caused the situation. But more than that, she was seeing her father use his position and influence, not just to protect her, but to ensure that other students would never have to endure what she had experienced. Dr. Williams had helped his daughter to her feet, gently adjusting her graduation gown and retrieving her honor cords from where they had been twisted during the confrontation. "Come on, sweetheart," he had said softly. "Let's go back to your graduation. You have a ceremony to complete, and an audience that's waiting to celebrate your achievements properly." As they had prepared to leave the conference room, McKenzie had made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Dr. Williams, I hope you understand that I was simply trying to maintain order and ensure the safety of all attendees. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made in challenging circumstances." But her words had fallen on deaf ears, as both father and daughter had already moved past the point where explanations or apologies could make any meaningful difference. The walk back to the main gymnasium had been surreal for Tasha. Just an hour earlier, she had been walking these same hallways as a triumphant valedictorian, preparing to deliver the speech that would cap her academic career. Now she was returning as someone who had been subjected to an injustice that would overshadow her achievements and change the trajectory of the entire ceremony. But, with her father beside her, she had felt a strength and determination that hadn't been there when she was alone with McKenzie. The gymnasium had erupted into applause the moment Dr. Williams and Tasha appeared in the doorway. The audience had been waiting in increasing agitation for over an hour, with rumors and speculation spreading through the crowd as people tried to understand what had happened to their valedictorian. Sarah Chen's livestream had attracted thousands of viewers, and other students and parents had been sharing their own videos and commentary across social media platforms, creating a groundswell of support for Tasha and condemnation of the officer's actions. Dr. Williams had walked directly to the podium, his daughter beside him, while McKenzie followed at a distance with the uncomfortable awareness that she was now the focus of 3,000 pairs of hostile eyes. The university president had taken the microphone with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to addressing large audiences. But the emotion in his voice had been unmistakable as he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, parents, faculty, and graduates," he had begun, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system that had been used so effectively by his daughter just hours earlier. "My name is Dr. Marcus Williams, and I serve as president of Riverside University. I am also the proud father of your valedictorian, Tasha Williams, who was just subjected to treatment that has no place in any educational setting or civilized society." The audience had listened in rapt attention as Dr. Williams had methodically described what had occurred. From the moment McKenzie had first approached the group of celebrating friends to the detention in the conference room and his daughter's treatment as a criminal suspect. His words had been measured and precise, but the underlying anger and protective instinct had been clear to everyone listening. "I want everyone in this room to understand that my daughter's only crime was delivering a speech that moved you to respond with appropriate emotion and enthusiasm." He had continued, "Her only violation was accepting congratulations from friends who have supported her throughout her academic career. For these acts of excellence and normal human connection, she was physically removed from this stage, detained without cause, and treated with a level of disrespect that defies explanation." As Dr. Williams had spoken, local news crews had begun arriving at the school, alerted by the social media coverage and recognizing that this story had all the elements of a major controversy. Television reporters and newspaper journalists had set up their equipment in the parking lot, preparing to cover what was clearly going to be a significant news event with implications far beyond a single graduation ceremony. Inside the gymnasium, Dr. Williams had been building toward a conclusion that would ensure this incident received the attention and response it deserved. I am calling for an immediate investigation into Officer McKenzie's actions today, including a review of the protocols and training that led her to believe that assaulting an honor student was an appropriate response to a moment of celebration. I am also calling for a comprehensive review of how law enforcement interacts with students in our schools, because what happened here today reveals systemic problems that must be addressed. The audience had responded with sustained applause. But Dr. Williams had raised his hand to indicate that he was not finished. More importantly, I want to make it clear that my daughter's achievements will not be overshadowed by one person's poor judgment and inappropriate behavior. Tasha Williams is graduating as valedictorian because she has earned that honor through years of academic excellence, community service, and leadership. She has been accepted to Harvard University with a full scholarship, and she represents the very best of what our educational system can produce when students are supported rather than criminalized. The mention of Harvard had sent another wave of applause through the audience, as parents and students alike were reminded of just how exceptional the young woman who had been so mistreated actually was. The contrast between Tasha's achievements and the way she had been treated had made McKenzie's actions seem even more outrageous and inexplicable. Dr. Williams had then done something unprecedented in his years of public speaking. He had stepped aside and handed the microphone to his daughter, giving her the opportunity to address the situation in her own words. Tasha had taken the microphone with hands that trembled slightly, but her voice had been strong and clear as she began to speak. "Thank you, Dad," she had said, her words carrying across the silent gymnasium as everyone strained to hear what she would say about her ordeal. "And thank you to everyone who has supported me during this difficult hour. I want you all to know that what happened to me today was wrong, but it will not define me or diminish my accomplishments." Tasha had paused, looking out over the audience with the same confidence she had displayed during her original valedictorian speech. "I also want you to know that this experience has taught me something important about the work that still needs to be done in our communities. If this can happen to me, a valedictorian with a university president for a father, then imagine what happens to students who don't have the same resources and support systems that I do." Her words had carried a wisdom and maturity that belied her 18 years, and the audience had responded with the kind of respectful silence that indicated they were hearing something important. So, I want to challenge all of us, especially my fellow graduates, to use our education and opportunities to ensure that no other student ever has to experience what I went through today. We have the power to change systems, to demand accountability, and to create the kind of world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. The gymnasium had erupted in the loudest applause of the day, with the graduating class leading the response as they stood and cheered for their classmate who had transformed a moment of injustice into a call for positive change. Parents had wiped away tears. Faculty members had stood with their hands over their hearts, and even the most cynical observers had been moved by Tasha's grace and strength in the face of adversity. As the applause had finally died down, Principal Davidson had approached the microphone to announce that the ceremony would continue with the formal presentation of diplomas. But the mood had changed completely from the beginning of the day. What had started as a routine graduation had become a pivotal moment in the community's understanding of justice, dignity, and the power of standing up for what is right. Officer McKenzie had remained at the edge of the stage during these speeches, her face flushed with embarrassment, and her career effectively ended by her own poor judgment. Within hours, videos of her dragging Tasha across the stage would be viewed millions of times, her actions dissected and criticized by commentators, legal experts, and ordinary citizens who could easily see the injustice of what had occurred. The formal presentation of diplomas had proceeded without further incident. But the energy in the room had been electric, with the awareness that everyone present had witnessed something historically significant. When Tasha's name had been called for her diploma, the standing ovation had lasted for nearly 5 minutes, with the entire graduating class joining in a sustained demonstration of support for their classmate and valedictorian. As she had walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Tasha had carried herself with the same dignity and poise she had shown throughout the ordeal. She had shaken hands with the school board members, accepted congratulations from faculty, and posed for official photographs with the composure of someone who had already learned to handle pressure and adversity with grace. The ceremony had concluded with the traditional tossing of graduation caps. But even this celebratory moment had carried additional meaning, as hundreds of caps had flown through the air in a display of unity and shared triumph over injustice. The class of 2023 would forever be remembered not just for their academic achievements, but for their response to a moment that tested their character and values. In the days that followed, the story of Tasha Williams and Officer McKenzie had dominated local and national news coverage. Legal experts had analyzed McKenzie's actions and found them to be not only inappropriate, but potentially criminal, opening the door for civil rights violations and assault charges. The officer had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, and her department had been forced to implement new protocols for interacting with students and young people. More importantly, the incident had sparked a broader conversation about how law enforcement officers are trained to handle situations involving young people, particularly students of color, who may be perceived as threatening even when they are simply celebrating achievements. Educational institutions across the country had begun reviewing their security protocols and retraining personnel to ensure that future graduations would be places of celebration rather than confrontation. Tasha had used her newfound platform to advocate for criminal justice reform and educational equity, speaking at conferences and writing articles about her experience and its broader implications. Her Harvard admission had remained secure, and she had begun her college career with a level of maturity and purpose that many students never develop. The injustice she had suffered had been transformed into a catalyst for positive change. Dr. Williams had worked with school district officials to implement new policies, ensuring that future graduation ceremonies would be celebrations of student achievement rather than exercises in crowd control. Officer McKenzie had eventually resigned from the police force and moved to another state. Her career in law enforcement effectively ended by her actions on that spring afternoon. The conference room where Tasha had been detained had been converted into a student resource center, with her story serving as a reminder that even in moments of injustice, dignity and grace can triumph over ignorance and prejudice. A plaque by the door quoted from her impromptu speech, "We have the power to change systems, to demand accountability, and to create the kind of world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." As Tasha had prepared to leave for Harvard that fall, she had reflected on how a day that was supposed to be about celebrating her academic achievements had instead become about something much more important: the power of standing up for what is right, even when doing so requires courage and comes at personal cost. Her graduation day had taught her that education is not just about acquiring knowledge, but about using that knowledge to make the world more just and equitable for everyone. The class of 2023 had dispersed to colleges and universities across the country, but they had carried with them the memory of a day when they had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature. They had seen how quickly injustice could occur, but they had also seen how ordinary people could stand up against it and demand better. Their graduation had ended not with a whimper, but with a roar of determination to create a future where no student would ever have to endure what their valedictorian had experienced. Years later, as Dr. Tasha Williams would eventually become known, The story of her graduation day would be remembered as a turning point in how communities think about justice, dignity, and the treatment of young people who dare to excel. The officer who had tried to diminish her had instead created a catalyst for change that would benefit countless students in years to come. And, in that irony, perhaps, lay the true lesson of a graduation day that had changed everything for everyone involved.